Now, this understanding of vibrational frequency can be looked at in a historical context as well. When you go back to the Copper Age, the previous Yuga before Kali Yuga, the world was brought to a state of peace, planetary peace, through the maintenance of its vibrational frequency by very, very, very powerful yogis. And how they did this was by extending and magnifying the vibrational resonance energies so that they would be broadcast and connected in a grid that was planet-wide. And the way they did this was building gigantic pyramids at various key places on grid lines around the earth. And taking the pyramids, let's say from Egypt, there was a king's chamber and a queen's chamber. And if you would go into those chambers, and I'm talking about thousands of years ago when these things were still functioning, and it was a male and a female yogi who would go into these chambers, but they were the most adept, the highest level frequency holders who would go into these. And sometimes there were several pyramids next to each other and with different pairs of yogis, and they would all have to resonate at the same chakra 7 frequency. And that would be broadcast because of the nature of the pyramid shape and the way it was constructed and what was made of it and the crystals inside of it, etc. It would connect with pyramids that had yogis in all parts of the world. There were such pyramids in Eastern Europe, they were in India, the Indian temples were shaped the same way, had the same functions. China had them, and there's even in what is now Antarctica, which was originally in a different place, and of course the Mayan pyramids, etc. And you also had yogis where there were no pyramids who would go to the top of mountains, and they would be able to capture the vibrational frequency and pass it on. To root it, it had to get rerouted so that it covered the entire planet, and it created an energy field that literally was strong enough to enter into the brain of every inhabitant and keep them functioning at chakra 6 or 7. And so there was peace. And there was never any conflict. There were no wars during that whole period. And the system functioned for a long period of time until what happened was they no longer were able to produce yogis who could do the work. Because to go into these pyramids, which was a gigantic isolation chamber, right? Totally dark, totally free of interference patterns. You were absolutely alone. You would go into a deep meditative state and become absolutely bodiless and empty. And in this nothingness, you would pick up the highest God self vibrations, and they would be magnified and bounce back and fill the space with such intense energy that then it would shoot out of the top and the sides of the pyramid and connect with others, and it would be broadcast around the planet. But you had to be able to tolerate that vibrational frequency for a very long period of time. You had to be able to maintain the silence and the focus and the concentration for hours at a time. Now, once this was created, the pyramid would continue to vibrate, and there were crystals inside it as well that held the vibration like a battery for long periods. So they didn't have to live in there. They would just go in when the vibrational frequency started to go down and give it a battery boost, but it maintained itself. And it was also a way to transmit information. So people could know what was going on in Mexico, in Egypt, or in China, or whatever, and if something had to be done in those different areas to balance a certain negative energy field, they could do that. And they could ally to create certain effects where there were weak spots in the what we could call the pranic meridians of Gaia. And it was kept at a very consistent level. But then once the power to do that had been lost, and the and there were no longer any or a sufficient number of yogis who had that power, the system broke down. And those civilizations fell, they were invaded, and the information about how to maintain those frequencies and all of the wisdom that had been accumulated was completely destroyed. So there was at that point a cut. It was the end of the Copper Age. Once that happened, huge earth changes happened, and an entirely new yuga began where that information and that power had been lost. And then we get a much lower level of yogic teaching that still comes from great beings like Buddha, Jesus, etc., but they were not nearly at the level of the beings of the previous yuga. And so we don't even know what our potential is or have any sense of how the world really functions when its residents are in true God consciousness. But it is this that we are called upon now to recreate, to return to. Nothing less will do if we are to save the planet. And some people are interested in doing that. So there is a civilization that is now dying. It must die to take the people suffering out of their misery, but there must be a rebirth and a redreaming, and that can only happen if our own vibrational frequency or that of sufficient number of yogis consistently is able to draw in that information and that power to shift the quantum wave function of the unified field that underlies this hologram, and do so with absolute accuracy.